You know, there are some days you just want to kick back, enjoy your own space, and not be bothered. This was supposed to be one of those days for me. My front door, however, sounded like it was auditioning for a role in a siege movie, with the kind of aggressive, insistent banging that instantly puts you on edge. Peeking through the peephole, I saw two figures dressed in what I can only describe as budget movie security guard costumes, complete with badges that looked like they came out of a cereal box. They were about to find out that trying to intimidate the actual county sheriff at his own home was a spectacularly bad career move. The pounding came again, louder this time, and I could hear a muffled voice booming, "HOA enforcement! Open up, Mr. Miller! We know you're in there!" I took a deep, calming breath. My day off was officially over, it seemed. I swung the door open, not wide, just enough to present a firm barrier if needed, and fixed them with the most neutral expression I could muster. On my doorstep stood Sergeant Stan Kowalski and Corporal Gary Gavel Grimes, two of our HOA's newly anointed Neighborhood Watch Security Committee enforcers. Stan, a portly man whose cheap nylon vest strained against his gut, puffed out his chest. Gary, lanky and looking perpetually nervous despite trying to emulate Stan's bravado, had his hand hovering near a comically oversized flashlight on his belt that he probably thought looked like a baton. "Mr. Miller," Stan began, his voice trying for authoritative but cracking slightly, "we've had multiple complaints about your, unapproved vegetation alteration." I raised an eyebrow. "Unapproved vegetation alteration? You're going to have to be more specific, Stan." He visibly bristled at my use of his first name. "That's Sergeant Kowalski to you, resident. And you know very well what we mean. The azalea bush. It's 3 inches over the approved height limit, as per Appendix B, subsection 4, paragraph C, of the revised landscaping guidelines." He thrust a laminated piece of paper at me, presumably a citation. I didn't take it. "And what exactly do you intend to do about this 3-inch overage, Stan?" My voice was quiet, calm. This seemed to embolden him. "This is an official warning. Non-compliance will result in fines and further punitive action as deemed necessary by the HOA board. We have the authority to ensure community standards are upheld." Gary, trying to back him up, chimed in, "Yeah, authority. We're just doing our job, sir, keeping this neighborhood up to snuff." He patted his flashlight. "People need to respect the rules." I looked from Stan's flushed face to Gary's nervous one. "Authority, you say? Tell me, Stan, Gary, under what statute are you operating? What specific county ordinance or state law grants you the authority to make demands like this, dressed as you are, and attempt to issue citations with threats of punitive action?" Stan scoffed. "It's in the HOA bylaws. We're acting as agents of the homeowners association." I nodded slowly. "I see. So, you're agents. Do you have any actual law enforcement credentials? Are you licensed security personnel under State Code 32, Chapter 17? They exchanged a quick, uncertain glance. We're the Neighborhood Watch and Security Committee," Stan blustered. "President Jenkins authorized us." I let a small smile play on my lips. "Brenda Jenkins, of course." "Well, Stan, Gary, there's a slight problem with your enthusiastic enforcement today." I reached for my wallet on the hall table beside me, slowly pulling out my badge and identification. "You see, while you're playing cops and robbers with landscaping guidelines, I'm David Miller, Sheriff David Miller, of this county." I held up my badge. "And I'm the one with actual authority here." The color drained from Stan's face so fast, I thought he might keel over. Gary's jaw literally dropped, his eyes wide as dinner plates, staring at the shiny star in my hand. The laminated citation fluttered from Stan's suddenly nerveless fingers and landed at his feet. The silence that followed was, as they say, deafening, broken only by the distant sound of a lawnmower, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding. You know, if you're ever in a situation like this, drop a comment and tell me how you handled it, because this was a new one for me, even after 20 years in law enforcement. It had all started so innocently, or so I thought, when I bought this house. I'd specifically chosen this neighborhood because it seemed quiet, well-maintained, a place where I could decompress from the daily stresses of being sheriff. I knew there was an HOA. It's pretty standard these days. I read the initial set of CCRs they gave me at closing. Seemed like the usual stuff. Keep your lawn tidy. Don't paint your house purple. No derelict cars. Fair enough, I thought. I'm a rule follower by nature, at least when the rules make sense. For the first 6 months, it was peaceful. I'd nod at neighbors, keep my yard immaculate, and generally fly under the radar. The HOA, presided over by the aforementioned Brenda Bulldozer Jenkins, seemed content with sending out a bland monthly newsletter and organizing the occasional potluck. Brenda herself was a woman who carried an air of perpetual importance, like she was single-handedly holding back the forces of chaos from engulfing our little suburban paradise. She was in her late 50s, with a helmet of rigidly sprayed blonde hair and a gaze that could curdle milk. My first direct interaction was minor. I'd left my recycling bin at the curb an hour past the designated pickup deadline, a genuine oversight. I found a politely worded yet undeniably firm notice tucked into my door handle, initialed by BJ. I chuckled, brought the bin in, and thought nothing more of it. Oh, how naive I was. That polite notice was merely the velvet glove. I hadn't yet felt the iron fist of Brenda Jenkins, nor did I realize she was grooming her very own private army. Little did I know that my quiet enjoyment of my property was about to become a battleground for common sense against petty tyranny. A battle that would escalate from polite notices about recycling bins to self-styled commandos attempting to enforce shrubbery height with the zeal of a SWAT team. The sheer audacity of it still boggles my mind when I think back on it. The incident with Stan and Gary at my door was the culmination, not the beginning, of a slowly escalating campaign of HOA overreach orchestrated by Brenda Jenkins. After the recycling bin note, things started to get weird. Brenda, it turned out, had a vision for our community, a vision of such rigid uniformity and compliance that it bordered on the absurd. She seemed to view the HOA bylaws not as guidelines for harmonious living, but as a sacred text granting her divine right to micromanage every blade of grass, every decorative gnome, every gust of wind that dared to blow a leaf onto the wrong driveway. Shortly after my recycling infraction, the newsletters started to change tone. They became less about potlucks and more about new rules, revised amendments, and stern warnings regarding violations, both real and imagined. One month, it was a decree about the exact shade of white permissible for window trim. Apparently eggshell was out, and only Arctic frost would do. Another month, a detailed addendum on holiday decorations, type, size, duration of display, down to the approved wattage for Christmas lights. Failure to comply would result in fines, sternly worded and publicly shaming, though she never actually posted names. The implication was there. Whispers started among the neighbors. Old Mr. Henderson got a notice because his garden hose wasn't coiled in a municipally approved manner, a term Brenda seemingly invented. The Peterson family were counseled on the excessive exuberance of their children's sidewalk chalk art. It was becoming less like a neighborhood and more like a high-security, low-fun correctional facility. Then came the formation of the Neighborhood Watch Security Committee. Brenda announced it at a sparsely attended HOA meeting, which I regrettably missed due to a late shift. According to my neighbor Susan, who did attend, Brenda presented it as a necessary step to enhance community safety and uphold our property values. She appointed Stan Kowalski as sergeant and Gary Grimes as corporal. Stan, a retired security guard from a local shopping mall, a fact he never tired of reminding people, took to his new role with an almost fanatical zeal. Gary, who worked part-time stocking shelves at the grocery store, seemed to just follow Stan's lead, perhaps eager for any semblance of authority. Their uniforms appeared shortly thereafter, navy blue polo shirts with HOA security poorly embroidered on the chest, khaki pants, and those ridiculous oversized badges. They acquired a used golf cart, which Brenda somehow convinced the board was a necessary patrol vehicle, and outfitted it with a flashing yellow light. Their patrols became a regular sight. At first, It was almost comical. They'd cruise around slowly, peering at properties with exaggerated scrutiny, occasionally stopping to consult their laminated copies of the bylaws. But the humor soon faded as their actions became more intrusive. They'd leave courtesy notices for things like a single weed in a flower bed or a car parked an inch too far from the curb. They started photographing perceived violations, their camera flashes startling residents in their own yards. I received a notice myself, a picture of my newspaper still in its plastic sleeve on my driveway at 10 a.m., with a highlighted section of the bylaws about maintaining a tidy appearance. The implication was that I should have retrieved it sooner. I was a sheriff. I dealt with actual crime, real threats, genuine danger on a daily basis. To come home and be subjected to this level of petty nonsense was more than just irritating. It was insulting. My frustration was building, but I kept telling myself to pick my battles. This wasn't my jurisdiction in that sense. It was a civil matter, an HOA squabble. But as their enforcement grew bolder, I started to worry. They weren't just annoying. They were creating an atmosphere of intimidation. I heard stories. Stan had allegedly cautioned a teenager for skateboarding on the sidewalk, telling him it was unauthorized vehicular movement. Gary had taken to shining his big flashlight into cars parked on the street late at night, supposedly checking for suspicious activity. The more power Brenda gave them, the more they abused it. They were bullies with badges bought on the internet, drunk on a thimbleful of authority. Brenda, meanwhile, seemed to revel in their activities, frequently seen conferring with them in her driveway, pointing towards various houses like a general planning a campaign. It was clear she was directing their every move, using them as her personal enforcers to impose her will on the neighborhood. I began to see the pattern. Brenda identifies a problem or invents a new rule, then dispatches Stan and Gary to harass the unfortunate resident. It was a classic abuse of power, albeit on a very small suburban scale. But abuse of power, no matter the scale, always rubs me the wrong way, especially when it's cloaked in a veneer of legitimacy, however flimsy. My azalea bush, the one that Stan claimed was 3 inches too tall, was just the latest pretext. I'd trimmed it myself a week prior, and I was meticulous. If it was over any prescribed height, it was by a negligible amount, certainly not enough to warrant an aggressive, door-pounding confrontation by 2 men dressed like B-movie cops. This wasn't about an azalea bush. This was about them pushing their boundaries, seeing how much they could get away with, and who they could intimidate. And they had chosen my door. They had chosen the wrong door. And as Stan and Gary stood there, stammering apologies and looking like they'd seen a ghost after I showed them my badge, I knew this little charade had gone far enough. It was time for Sheriff Miller to bring some actual order to this neighborhood, an order based on reason and law, not on Brenda Jenkins' whims and her toy soldier's delusions of grandeur. My resolve hardened. This wasn't just about an overgrown bush anymore. It was about restoring peace and sanity to our community. And I had a pretty good idea how to start. My first step, after Stan and Gary had practically sprinted off my porch, their faces a mixture of terror and disbelief, was to actually measure the damn azalea bush. I retrieved a tape measure from my garage, went out to the front yard, and meticulously measured the offending plant from multiple angles. The tallest point was, at most, half an inch over the ridiculously specific height Brenda's latest addendum had decreed, half an inch. For this, I had 2 aspiring tyrants banging on my door, threatening punitive action. The sheer pettiness was astounding, but I knew this wasn't really about the azalea. It was about control. It was about their perceived authority. After documenting the actual height with a few quick photos on my phone, old habits die hard, I went inside and pulled out my thick binder of HOA documents. Most homeowners, I suspect, glance at these things once and then file them away to gather dust. But as a lawman, I have a certain appreciation for the written word, especially when it comes to rules and regulations. I started with the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CCRs, then moved to the bylaws, and finally, the accumulated pile of newsletters, amendments, and clarifications that Brenda had issued over the past year. I read them carefully, highlighting sections pertaining to rule enforcement, the powers of the board, and any mention of a security committee or similar body. What I found was interesting, and frankly, a little disturbing. The original CCRs were fairly standard, outlining the board's responsibilities for common area maintenance and architectural review. There were provisions for levying fines for clear violations, but the process required written notification, a reasonable period to cure the violation, and an opportunity for the homeowner to appeal to the board. Nowhere did it mention quasi-military style enforcement squads or on-the-spot citations delivered with aggressive posturing. The Neighborhood Watch Security Committee was, as far as I could tell from the official documents, a fairly recent invention of Brenda's, likely approved by a compliant or indifferent board. The minutes from the meeting where it was established were vague, granting it authority to observe and report, and assist in promoting adherence to community standards. There was nothing about wearing uniforms, carrying oversized flashlights as symbols of authority, or confronting homeowners in an intimidating manner. Observe and report is a long way from bang on doors and issue demands. Next, I decided to broaden my research beyond the HOA's own paperwork. I logged on to my work computer, even on my day off. Some resources are just easier to access that way, and started looking into Florida state statutes governing homeowners associations. There are specific laws detailing what HOAs can and cannot do, particularly concerning fines and enforcement. Again, the emphasis was on due process, written notices, and appeal rights. Then I delved into laws regarding private security. In our state, to act as a security guard, even an unarmed one, and particularly if wearing any kind of uniform or badge that could imply authority, requires licensing. This includes background checks and mandatory training. I had a strong suspicion that neither Stan nor Gary possessed such licenses. What they were doing, especially dressed as they were and acting with such assumed authority, was skating dangerously close to impersonating law enforcement or, at the very least, misrepresenting themselves as licensed security personnel, which carries its own set of penalties. Color of law violations are serious. They were acting as if they had official authority they didn't possess. I made notes, cross-referencing the HOA bylaws with state statutes. A clear picture was emerging. Brenda Jenkins had created a monster, and her two eager minions were running amok, significantly exceeding any legitimate authority granted by the HOA documents, and quite possibly breaking state law. This wasn't just petty tyranny. It was potentially illegal tyranny. I started a new file, titling it HOA Overreach Jenkins. I began documenting everything: the Azalea incident, past notices I'd received, an overview of the security committee's formation and typical behavior. I recalled a conversation with Mrs. Davison from down the street a few weeks back. She's an elderly widow, and she'd been visibly upset after Stan and Gary had left a violation notice on her door because her porch light, one of those decorative, low-wattage types, was supposedly not bright enough for nighttime security standards. Another rule Brenda had seemingly pulled from thin air. Mrs. Davison had been too intimidated to complain. I made a note to speak with her again, and perhaps a few other neighbors who I knew had also been on the receiving end of Brenda's committee's zeal. If this was a pattern of harassment, especially targeting vulnerable residents, it elevated the situation beyond a simple nuisance. I spent the next few days subtly gathering more information. During my evening walks, which I now took with a more observant eye, I noted Stan and Gary on their golf cart patrol. I saw them stop and confer over a property where a child's bicycle had been left on the lawn. I even witnessed Gary taking a photo of someone's trash cans that were, heaven forbid, placed 3 feet from the curb instead of the prescribed 2. Each little act of overreach I cataloged. I wasn't planning on staging a coup or starting a neighborhood war. My goal was to stop the harassment and ensure the HOA operated within the bounds of its own rules and the law. If that meant clipping Brenda Jenkins' wings and grounding her security force, so be it. I was pretty sure the smoking gun would be a combination of their lack of proper licensing, if any, and the clear overstepping of authority outlined even in the HOA's own vague documents regarding the committee. I also found a clause in the HOA bylaws about nuisance, defining it as any activity that unreasonably interferes with the peaceful possession and proper use of property by residents. Ironic, isn't it? Brenda and her committee, in their obsessive quest to eliminate every perceived micro-nuisance, had become the biggest nuisance of all. The more I investigated, the angrier I got, not in a hot-headed way, but in a cold, methodical resolve. These people, puffed up with self-importance, were making life miserable for others over trivialities, all under the guise of community standards. And now, they'd brought it to my doorstep. They had awakened the sleeping sheriff. The challenge was how to address this effectively and bring it to a permanent resolution. A direct confrontation with Brenda could devolve into a shouting match. Simply telling Stan and Gary to knock it off clearly hadn't been enough, even with the shock of finding out who I was. They were puppets. Brenda pulled the strings. I needed to go to the source and dismantle her apparatus of control, armed with irrefutable facts and the weight of actual law. The confrontation at my door with Stan and Gary, where I revealed my identity as the county sheriff, was the spark that ignited my focused effort. But it wasn't an isolated incident in their campaign of neighborhood domination. The unapproved vegetation alteration regarding my azalea bush was, in retrospect, almost predictable given their recent pattern. A week before that fateful Tuesday, I'd observed Stan and Gary having a very animated discussion with Mr. Henderson about the color of the mulch he'd just put down in his flower beds. Apparently, dark walnut was the HOA-approved shade, and Mr. Henderson had opted for red cedar, a flagrant violation of an obscure guideline Brenda had emailed out, buried deep within a newsletter attachment titled Spring Beautification Recommendations. Mandatory compliance. Mr. Henderson, a feisty octogenarian who'd lived in the neighborhood since before the HOA even existed, had apparently given them quite an earful, but they'd still slapped a notice of non-compliance on his door. He grumbled to me about it over the fence, calling them Brenda's brown shirts. That same week, the Peterson family, who lived across the street, received a formal warning because their son, young Timmy, had left his new basketball hoop at the edge of their driveway overnight. The rule, again recently invented or at least newly enforced with vigor, stated that all portable recreational equipment must be stored out of sight when not in active use. They were fuming, as Timmy had just forgotten, and Brenda's enforcers had pounced before sunrise. My own infraction, the azalea bush, was almost laughably minor. I maintained my yard meticulously. As I mentioned, it was at most half an inch taller than the decreed maximum height, a new rule only recently circulated. I suspect Brenda or her watchdogs had literally gone around with a tape measure, actively looking for things to cite. It felt targeted, almost like a test. Perhaps word had gotten back to Brenda about my somewhat amused reaction to the newspaper on the driveway warning a few weeks prior, and she'd decided to escalate, to see if Sheriff Miller was all talk, or perhaps she simply didn't know who I really was, beyond just another resident. The aggressive banging on my door that Tuesday morning was what truly set things in motion for this particular showdown. I was in my kitchen, enjoying a rare, quiet cup of coffee and reading the actual news on my tablet. Thank you very much, not on the driveway, when the assault began. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a series of thuds, hard enough to rattle the windows. My first thought, conditioned by years in law enforcement, was that it might be something serious, an emergency. So, when I saw Stan and Gary through the peephole, puffed up in their ridiculous outfits, my reaction was a mixture of relief and profound irritation. I opened the door, as I described, and Stan launched into his spiel. Mr. Miller, HOA enforcement. We've had multiple complaints about your unapproved vegetation alteration. His voice was loud, officious, clearly meant to intimidate not just me but anyone within earshot. He really leaned into the multiple complaints part, which I highly doubted. Who would complain about a half-inch of azalea? Only Brenda, acting through her proxies. Or perhaps she'd coach Stan to say that to make it sound more significant. Multiple complaints? I repeated, keeping my voice level. From whom, Stan? And what precisely is the alteration you're referring to? He visibly preened, enjoying his moment of power. We are not required to disclose the source of complaints, resident. It is sufficient that they were made and verified by us, the duly appointed security committee. Your azalea bush, Mr. Miller, on the north side of your walkway, is exceeding the maximum permissible height of 36 inches, as clearly stated in the Revised Landscaping Code, Addendum 7, Paragraph 2. He had the citation ready, laminated and official-looking, if you didn't examine it too closely. Gary, standing slightly behind Stan, nodded vigorously, his hand now resting firmly on his large flashlight as if ready to draw it. Yeah, Gary echoed. It's a clear violation. We're just here to issue the warning. You've got 48 hours to rectify, or fines will be levied. Their entire demeanor was aggressive, designed to overwhelm and cow a resident into immediate submission. This wasn't about community standards. It was a power trip. I let them finish. Then, I asked my questions about their authority, the specific statutes they were operating under, their licensing, all the things they clearly hadn't expected and couldn't answer. Their bravado began to crumble visibly under scrutiny. Stan's face went from smug to uncertain, then to defensive. We don't need any special license. We're appointed by the HOA, President Jenkins said. That's when I interrupted him gently. What President Jenkins said, and what the law allows, can often be two different things, Stan. And then, the reveal. My name is David Miller, Sheriff David Miller. I watched the entire spectrum of shock, disbelief, and then dawning horror cross their faces. Stan's carefully prepared speech about azaleas and addendums seemed to evaporate from his mind. The laminated citation slipped from his hand. Gary looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Sheriff? Stan stammered, his voice now a squeak. You're the county sheriff? I nodded. That's correct. And as the chief law enforcement officer of this county, I have a few concerns about your current activities, gentlemen. Specifically, about your uniforms, your implication of authority, the nature of your enforcement, and the harassment of residents, myself included. The transformation was complete. The puffed-up enforcers deflated like punctured balloons. Suddenly, their navy blue polo shirts looked less like uniforms and more like costumes. Their cereal box badges seemed utterly pathetic. The oversized flashlight on Gary's belt appeared more like a child's toy than a tool of intimidation. Stan began to stammer apologies. We didn't know, Sheriff. We were just... President Jenkins, she told us, we have to enforce the rules. Gary was just shaking his head, mute. I suggest, I said, my voice still calm but now carrying an unmistakable edge of official command, that you both remove yourselves from my property. And I further suggest that the Neighborhood Watch Security Committee suspend all enforcement activities until the HOA board and I have had a serious discussion about your legal standing and operational procedures. Am I clear? They couldn't nod fast enough. Yes, Sheriff. Perfectly clear, Sheriff. They chorused, practically tripping over each other to back away from my porch. They turned and scurried down my walkway, not even bothering with their golf cart, which was parked at the curb. They just wanted to get away. I watched them go, the two self-styled protectors of suburban order now looking like scolded schoolboys. The immediate crisis was over, but the real work was just beginning. They might have been chastened, but Brenda Jenkins was still out there, and I knew she wouldn't give up her little empire easily. This incident, however, provided me with the perfect leverage. They had overplayed their hand spectacularly, and directly with me. It was time to bring this to the HOA board, armed with my research, the fresh memory of this confrontation, and the full weight of my office, used judiciously but firmly. My neighbors deserve to live without this kind of petty harassment. The days following the azalea confrontation, as I'd started calling it in my head, were interestingly quiet from Stan and Gary. Their little golf cart patrols seemed to have ceased entirely. I imagined Brenda Jenkins was probably in damage control mode, trying to figure out her next move now that her primary enforcers had been so thoroughly spooked. I used this lull to finalize my strategy. My objective wasn't to humiliate Brenda, though a part of me certainly felt she deserved it, but to bring about a lasting change in how the HOA operated, ensuring it adhered to its own governing documents and, more importantly, state law. I compiled my findings into a formal letter addressed to the HOA Board of Directors, crying the HOA management company that handled our finances and official correspondence. In clear, concise language, I outlined my concerns. I detailed the incident at my home, including Stan and Gary's attire, their aggressive demeanor, and their claims of authority. I then systematically listed the HOA bylaw sections they were potentially violating regarding harassment and due process. More critically, I cited the specific Florida statutes concerning licensed security personnel, impersonation of authority, and the potential liabilities the HOA as a whole could face if its agents continued to operate outside legal boundaries. I pointed out that their actions could constitute harassment and intimidation, creating a hostile environment for residents, things that could lead to actual lawsuits against the HOA, which would mean increased dues for everyone to cover legal fees and settlements. I also included a section on the proper procedures for rule enforcement, as per our own CC/Rs, written warnings, cure periods, appeals, none of which were being consistently followed by Brenda's committee. My letter wasn't emotional, it was factual, legalistic, and carried an implicit warning. I signed it, David Miller, resident, but then added my official title underneath. Sheriff. Our county. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't just a disgruntled homeowner complaining. This was a law enforcement professional pointing out serious irregularities and potential illegalities. I sent the letter via certified mail, return receipt requested, to each board member and the management company. This created a paper trail and ensured they couldn't claim they hadn't received it. I also emailed a copy for quicker dissemination. Within 48 hours, the phone calls started. The first was from Harold Henderson, the board treasurer, a retired accountant who generally tried to stay out of Brenda's political maneuvering. He sounded flustered. Sheriff Miller, David, I received your letter. Good heavens! Is it really this serious? Impersonating officers? Lawsuits? Harold, I said calmly, I wouldn't have put it in writing if I didn't believe there were serious issues that need to be addressed. Stan and Gary's conduct at my home was unacceptable, and from what I've gathered, it's part of a pattern. The way they're operating, dressed up, and acting like they have police powers exposes the HOA to significant risk. He sighed heavily. Brenda established that committee. She said it was to help with standards. I never imagined. Look, we have an emergency board meeting scheduled for tomorrow night to discuss this. Can you attend? I'll be there, Harold, I assured him. The next call was, surprisingly, not from Brenda, but from Margaret, the board secretary, a quiet woman I'd occasionally seen at community events. She sounded genuinely concerned. Sheriff, thank you for bringing this to light officially. Some of us have had reservations about the direction things have been going, but Brenda can be very forceful. This was an interesting development. It seemed I might have allies on the board, or at least members who were now emboldened to question Brenda's authority. Brenda herself remained silent, at least towards me. I could only imagine the frantic phone calls she was making, trying to rally support or perhaps figure out how to spin this. The day of the emergency board meeting arrived. It was held in the small community clubhouse. Usually, these meetings were sparsely attended. Myself, Harold, Margaret, 2 other board members, Brenda, and maybe 1 or 2 other curious residents. Tonight, however, word had clearly gotten out. The room was packed. At least 30 homeowners were present. A record turnout. Many faces looked worried, others hopeful. Stan and Gary were conspicuously absent. Brenda sat at the head of the table, looking imperious as usual, but there was a tightness around her mouth that betrayed her stress. Harold, as treasurer, called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the elephant in the room. We are here tonight to discuss a serious matter raised by resident David Miller concerning the activities of the Neighborhood Watch Security Committee. Sheriff Miller, if you would. All eyes turned to me. I stood up, my letter already distributed to the board members. Thank you, Harold. And members of the board, fellow residents. I kept my tone professional and measured. As outlined in my letter, the incident at my home on Tuesday morning involving Mr. Kowalski and Mr. Grimes was the catalyst for my formal complaint. But my concerns are broader. I then walked them through the key points: the lack of legal authority for their enforcement style, the misrepresentation of authority through uniforms and badges, the failure to follow established HOA procedures for violations, and the potential legal and financial liabilities for the entire community. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make accusations beyond what I could support with facts or legal citations. I spoke about the importance of respecting individual rights and fostering a true sense of community, rather than one built on fear and intimidation. The goal of an HOA, I concluded, should be to maintain and enhance the quality of life for all residents, operating transparently and within the bounds of the law. Unfortunately, the actions of this committee, under its current operational guidelines and leadership, have done the opposite for many of us. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Then a ripple of murmurs and nods from the assembled residents. Several hands went up. Mr. Henderson, the one with the wrong mulch, was the first recognized. "Sheriff's right," he boomed. "Those two jokers came to my house, told me my mulch was subversive. Subversive! I've lived here 40 years. Mrs. Davison then shyly raised her hand and, voice trembling slightly, recounted her experience with the porch light. One by one, other residents shared their stories of petty harassment, unreasonable demands, and the general feeling of being watched and judged by Stan and Gary. It was like a dam had broken. The collective frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface for months finally boiled over. Brenda Jenkins listened, her face growing stonier with each testimony. When the residents had finished, Harold turned to Brenda. "Brenda, as president, and the one who established this committee, do you have a response?" Brenda Jenkins rose slowly, a sheath of papers clutched in her hand. Her usual confident, almost belligerent demeanor was still there, but it was clear the tide of public opinion in the room was heavily against her. She attempted her usual tactic of bluster and deflection. "Esteemed board members, fellow homeowners," she began, her voice a little shriller than usual. "I am shocked, simply shocked, by these exaggerations and misinterpretations. The Neighborhood Watch Security Committee, under the valiant leadership of Sergeant Kowalski and Corporal Grimes, was established with the noblest of intentions, to protect our property values, ensure our safety, and uphold the high standards that make the Willows the premier community it is." She paused for effect, but no applause came, only a stony silence. "These men are dedicated volunteers," she continued, "sacrificing their personal time to ensure compliance with our democratically established bylaws. Are we to punish dedication? Are we to condemn vigilance?" She then tried to discredit me indirectly. "Perhaps some newer residents are not fully accustomed to the level of excellence we strive for here. Perhaps some people interpret helpful reminders as harassment. The rules are the rules. They apply to everyone equally." This last statement drew a few audible scoffs from the audience. Old Man Hemlock, who usually only spoke up to complain about the volume of the pool pump, suddenly piped up from the back, "Rules you keep making up as you go along, Brenda." A smattering of "Yas" and "That's right" followed. Brenda's face flushed a deep red. "That is an outrageous accusation. All our guidelines are properly vetted and communicated." She shuffled her papers. "I have here testimonials from satisfied residents who appreciate the committee's efforts." She seemed to be searching for a document that wasn't there. It was becoming clear she was unprepared for this level of unified opposition. Harold, bless his newfound spine, interjected calmly, "Brenda, with all due respect, The issue isn't just about the rules themselves, but how they are being enforced. Sheriff Miller has raised serious legal points regarding the committee's appearance, their actions, and their potential lack of proper licensing if they are to be considered security. Do Stan Kowalski or Gary Grimes possess state-issued security licenses? Brenda waved her hand dismissively. They are volunteers, not hired guards. It's a neighborhood watch. The title security is merely to emphasize their role in, well, securing our standards. I decided to step in. With respect, Madam President, I said, choosing my words carefully. The perception they create is key. When individuals wear uniforms and badges, however unofficial, and aggressively confront residents making demands and threatening penalties, they are acting under color of authority. If they are not licensed, and they are indeed misrepresenting themselves or exceeding the very limited scope of a typical neighborhood watch, which is primarily observation and reporting to actual law enforcement, then the HOA is exposing itself to serious liability. Ignorance of the law, or good intentions, are not a defense. Margaret, the secretary, then spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. Sheriff Miller also pointed out, and correctly so, that our own bylaws call for a very specific procedure for violations. A written notice from the board or management company, a reasonable time to cure, and an appeal process, none of which seems to be consistently happening. Instead, we have on-the-spot verbal confrontations and demands for immediate action. The other two board members, who had largely been silent observers of Brenda's reign, began to nod in agreement. They'd clearly read my letter and heard enough from their neighbors. The united front of the board, coupled with the overwhelming sentiment of the residents and my legal points, seemed to finally penetrate Brenda's wall of denial. Her shoulders sagged, just slightly. She knew she was beaten. Well, she said, her voice losing its fight, if the committee's actions have been misunderstood, perhaps some retraining is in order. Or a review of their guidelines. Harold shook his head. Brenda, I think it's more than that. Based on Sheriff Miller's letter and the testimonies tonight, I move that the Neighborhood Watch Security Committee, as currently constituted and operating, be immediately suspended pending a full review by this board and legal counsel, if necessary, to ensure full compliance with state law and our own governing documents. Margaret immediately seconded the motion. All in favor? Harold asked. 4 hands went up. Harold, Margaret, and the 2 other board members. Brenda stared straight ahead, her hand remaining on the table. Opposed? Harold asked gently. Brenda remained motionless. The motion carries 4-0, with 1 abstention, Harold announced. A wave of relief, almost palpable, washed over the room. Some people actually clapped. Brenda Jenkins simply gathered her papers, her face a mask of fury and defeat, and without a word, stalked out of the clubhouse. The meeting continued for a short while after her dramatic exit. The board members openly thanked me for bringing the issues forward in such a clear and actionable way. They pledged to revisit their enforcement procedures, emphasizing communication and due process. They also discussed forming a new, genuinely voluntary neighborhood watch group focused solely on observation and liaison with my sheriff's department. No uniforms, no badges, no delusions of authority. The very next day, an official notice was posted on the community bulletin board and emailed to all residents, signed by the remaining 4 board members, announcing the immediate suspension of all activities by the Neighborhood Watch Security Committee and outlining steps for a comprehensive review of HOA enforcement policies. Stan and Gary seemed to vanish from public view. Their golf cart was no longer seen patrolling. Brenda Jenkins, though still technically president until the next election, lost all her clout. She stopped attending board meetings and her newsletters ceased. The atmosphere in the Willows changed almost overnight. People seemed more relaxed, more friendly. The oppressive sense of being constantly watched and judged lifted. Kids played more freely. Mr. Henderson proudly kept his red cedar mulch. Mrs. Poutnote sparred not. Davison's porch light, however dim, shone without fear of citation. It's funny, isn't it? How a little bit of unchecked power in the wrong hands can create so much misery, and how a little bit of informed, collective action can set things right. I didn't set out to be an HOA reformer when I moved in. I just wanted a peaceful place to live. But when that peace was threatened by petty tyranny, I found I couldn't just stand by. Sometimes, even a sheriff has to take care of problems a little closer to home, using not just the authority of a badge, but the power of reason, law, and community. And let me tell you, that first cup of coffee after all this settled down, on my quiet porch, with my perfectly legal azalea bush nearby, tasted like pure victory. If you've got a story about reclaiming your peace from an overzealous authority, I'd love to hear it in the comments. We all need a reminder that sometimes David really can take down Goliath, especially when Goliath is just a bully in a cheap uniform.